Philipp Bruckmayr has studied Arabic and Islamic studies, Turkish studies, and history at the University of Vienna. He has published on Islam in Southeast Asia, Arab and Islamic communities in the America, post-classical Islamic theology, and on religion and politics in Syria. Currently a lecturer at the University of Vienna in Arabic and Islamic studies, he has held fellowships and lectureships at the International Research Center for Cultural Studies in Vienna, Passau University, University Kebangasan, Malaysia, and the University of Exeter. He was awarded the Dissertation Prize of the German Association of Middle Eastern Studies in 2015 and the Dr. Hermann Stieglecker Scholarship for Christian Islamic Studies on the Forum of World Religions in 2017. He is a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the German Association of Middle Eastern Studies. The presentation today will be titled Ṣadr al-Shari'a al-Thānī al-Maḥbūbī al-Bukhārī as the pivotal figure in synthesizing Ḥanafī uṣūl al-fiqh and Māturīdī kalām. So I pass the floor to you, Philipp. You're all ears.
Good. So thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me at this very stimulating conference. One topic which has come up every once in a while in the last couple of days was the Naqshbandiyya. Therefore, I thought I would start this presentation with a principle which is attributed to Baha'u'ddin al-Naqshband, namely Indiraj al-Nihaya fil Bidaya, that is the inclusion of the end in the beginning. So I will begin this presentation with what will come at its end. Here we have an 18th century anonymous poem on inter-madhab differences between the Māturīdī and the al-Shari'a school in kalām. And at the end of this short poem, the author, he gives a list of works he used for this endeavor. And the first one he mentions is al-Tawdīḥ by Ṣadr al-Shari'a al-Thani of Bukhara. So this presentation will be about this figure and his major work in uṣūl al-fiqh, al-Tawdīḥ bi Khadr awamid al-Tanqīḥ, which is an auto commentary to his earlier work, al-Tanqīḥ fil uṣūl al-fiqh. But more specifically, this presentation will be about how and why this author, who left no kalam work proper, and his major work in uṣūl al-fiqh end up as a prime reference in a poem on inter-madhab differences in kalam, and indeed becomes a prime reference in this whole genre, which is a mostly Ottoman genre of ikhtilaf al-madahib in kalam. I will argue that Ṣadr al-Shari'a was a key figure, or the key figure even, in lastingly synthesizing Ḥanafī uṣūl al-fiqh and Māturīdī kalām, and that his al-Tawdīḥ and one specific section in it, known as the four prolegomena, even though, or perhaps just because they pertain to the field of legal theory, represent a missing link in the evolution of the Māturīdī madhab identity as it developed, especially from the 16th and 17th century onwards in the Ottoman Empire. Just a few words about the intellectual background of the time and of Ṣadr al-Shari'a al-Thani. It is important to note that in the wake of Fakhr ad-Din al-Razi, who died in 1210, a new wave of Ash'ari kalam emerged, which was strongly influenced by Ibn Sina and was strongly philosophy laden, if you will. At the same time, also a new wave of legal theory, tellingly later referred to as the mutakallimun, that is the theologians' approach, began to develop, and this new type of uṣūl al-fiqh writing was based on a process of systematization through the consistent application of the terminology and methods drawn from philosophy and logic. Major work in this regard here again, Arazi's al-Mahsul and Ibn al-Hajib's al-Mukhtasar should be mentioned. Now, Ṣadr al-Shari'a al-Thani, who died in 1349, he grew up in a family of famous legal scholars in Bukhara. In fact, for example, his great-grandfather, Ṣadr al-Shari'a al-Awwal, he was locally known as the second Abu Hanifa. And in this scholarly environment, it had been a long tradition, basically, since the late 10th century, that the uṣūl al-fiqh had always been tied to the theological teachings of al-Maturīdī and his local followers. Nevertheless, until Ṣadr al-Shari'a al-Thani, the so-called mutakallimun approach in uṣūl al-fiqh seemingly didn't have any influence in this environment. So it was actually Ṣadr al-Thani, and his al-Tabīʿ represents the first Transoxanian Hanafi scholar to explicitly acknowledge and thoroughly engage himself with this new style of uṣūl writing, while at the same time anchoring himself firmly in Hanafi tradition. An example for this is a quote I will give from the introduction to his al-Tabīʿ, in which he notes the following. He writes that his work is a defense of the foundational uṣūl text of Fakhr ad-Dīn al-Fastawi, who died in 1089, and on which the bulk of later Hanafi legal theory had been built. So Ṣadr al-Shari'a al-Thani notes that this text had become unduly criticized in his time, and that he felt compelled to expound its real meanings and understanding by employing the principles, and I quote now, by employing the principles, bases, and categories of the instrumental sciences, and by taking the main issues of al-Mahsul, so that is al-Razi's influential work, and the uṣūl of Ibn Khachib, that is his Mukhtasar, into account. So he is explicitly attempting to bring Hanafi uṣūl in line with the state of the art, if you will. Now, it is interesting or quite important that in this uṣūl text we find a specific section which is located very much at the intersection of uṣūl al-fiqh and kalām, and this is the debate on husn qubh, the debate of good and evil, and he starts this chapter under the headline of "What has been commanded is necessarily good," which is an idea to which inter alia Hanafis and Maturidis would subscribe, but certainly not the Ash'ari school. So what follows in this section is basically the first major Hanafi refutation of an Ash'ari theory on good and evil, and also on human volition, which was introduced by Fakhr ad-Dīn ar-Rāzi, and this is the so-called Murajjih argument. When talking about this debate, Ṣadr al-Shari'a is fully aware of the fact that this debate is located at the intersections of uṣūl al-fiqh and kalām, as you can see from this short passage, where he notes that it is not just one of the most important questions or problems in uṣūl, but that it is also about the most important investigations of the rational sciences and of the transmitted sciences. Now, to return of the Murajjih, or the so-called preponderator argument of ar-Rāzi, it says that the necessary preponderator, the Murajjih, for a human to act rather than not to act, or to produce either of two opposing acts, and therefore also for the tipping of the scale for the existence rather than the inexistence of the given act, could only derive from Allah and not from human volition or ikhtiyar. And this Ash'ari doctrine, masterfully and very influentially expounded by Fakhruddin Arazi, then becomes the key point of Ṣadr al-Shari'a's refutation, in which he enumerates the Ash'ari arguments, or rather Arazi's arguments, and then seeks to refute them in a discussion which would become known as the four prolegomena, al-Muqaddimat al-Arba'a, which are somehow hidden in this, which is a purely kalām discussion, which is, however, hidden in this uṣūl text, at-Tawdīh. As will be shown, there developed a separate genre of glosses on this debate, which is both about questions of good and evil, and primarily about the question if humans have ikhtiyar, that is free will, or not, in which the Māturīdī school affirms ikhtiyar, or at least a partial ikhtiyar, whereas the Ash'ari school is rejecting this view. Now, a few words about the reception history of the text. Just like the eventually most widespread Māturīdī Aqidah, the al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya, also the Tawdīh of Ṣadr al-Shari'a would be transmitted primarily in form of a commentary by Sa'd ad-Din al-Taftazani, who wrote his at-Talwīh al-Tawdīh 10 years after the death of Ṣadr al-Shari'a in 1375. In the form of this commentary, the text really became widely distributed, and we could argue it would become one of two, or perhaps even the dominant text in uṣūl al-fiqh in both the Ottoman and the Mughal empires. What is interesting, however, is that given the debate on the four prolegomena, al-Taftazani's commentary amounts to a counter refutation of Ṣadr al-Shari'a's refutation of Arazi, and therefore, of course, the ground was prepared for critical super commentaries by Ḥanafī and Māturīdī scholars. Now, the text was first, or Ṣadr al-Shari'a's text, and then al-Taftazani's commentary, they were first, of course, transmitted in Transoxania to places like Herat, also quite early on to Delhi, and at the same time, the text also embarked on its movement towards the West, on its movement towards Ottoman Anatolia, and in this respect, the text and the discussions of the text went through a number of relay points on its travel westwards to Ottoman Anatolia. One of these relay points was the Eretnit realm, where the scholar turned ruler, Qadi Burhanuddin as-Sivasi, wrote a critical evaluation of the Talwīh, Tarjīh al-Talwīh. Another way of transmission was via Mamluk Cairo and Damascus, and there a very important scholar and former student of al-Taftazani, Ala-ad-Din al-Bukhārī, who was also a heavy enemy, if you will, of Ibn Arabi's thought and of Ibn Taymiyyah at the same time. And al-Bukhārī not only transmitted and taught the text, but he also wrote his counter-refutation of parts of al-Taftazani's commentary from a Ḥanafī Māturīdī position. A third relay point was the Crimea, where there were scholars like al-Basasi and Ahmad ibn Abdallah al-Kirimi, who later on both went to settle in the Ottoman Empire. What is important to note is that already the first major Ottoman work on uṣūl al-fiqh, the Fusul al-Badaya of Shams ad-Din al-Fanari, who died in 1438, was very much built on Ṣadr al-Shari'a's work, especially, of course, in the sections on Huzn and Kubh. So he relied extensively on Ṣadr al-Shari'a. But at this time, even though it already had acquired a prominent place in Ottoman Ḥanafī uṣūl, the debate was still one which took place in an uṣūl al-fiqh framework. But this was about to change. So very much at the same time, in the first half of the 15th century, the first decidedly Māturīdī creed produced by an Anatolian scholar, namely Khidr Beg, who died in 1459, was produced. And at the same time, we are now reaching the Istanbul period under Mehmed II in the Ottoman Empire. We know that the Sultan, he commissioned debates and book competitions on Tahafut al-Falasifa, in which aspiring and established scholars vied for influence and vied for prestige. And we already have a couple of nice studies on these commissioned debates on Tahafut al-Falasifa. What has been overlooked so far, or mostly overlooked, is that similar debates were also commissioned by the Sultan on Ṣadr al-Shari'a's four prolegomena. And this is the starting point of a new genre of hashiyas on the Talwīḥ and the Tawdīḥ. And these are so-called hashiyas or hawashia al-Muqaddimat al-Arba'a. So this is a whole genre which only takes this one extract, which is very important for philosophical discussions and kalām discussions out of the uṣūl al-fiqh work, and discusses it separate. And from these debates at Mehmed II's court, there emerged a number of such glosses. We have a list of 7 scholars who took part in these debates, and each of these 7 scholars, he wrote 1 or 2 glosses on the subject. So the first one was Mullah Arab, and then another one was Kastali, another one was Khatib Sadeh, and another one again was Samsuni, and there were a few others. And it has been observed by Mehmet Kalaycı that actually these debates on the four prolegomena, in which Ṣadr al-Shari'a tries to show that Ḥanafī uṣūl and Ḥanafī kalām is not only on par with the new wave of Asharism, but actually perhaps as an own school of theological thought, perhaps even not just on par, but actually superior to Asharism. And of course, these courtly debates on these texts, they were an ideal starting point to argue for a distinctively Māturīdī identity also in the Ottoman Empire. Or at least we can say that in these glosses, the notion of the Māturīdīya as a distinctive theological school for the first time, if you will, becomes a major frame of reference for Ottoman authors. And the next development is, we can say that by the 16th and specifically the 17th century, it's not only a mere frame of reference, but it actually develops into a clearly present madhab identity. And this is achieved primarily via 2 different newly emerging genres in the field of kalām, which are often intersecting. The first one we could call is the genre of Risala al-Irada al-Juz'iyya or Risala al-Ikhtiyār al-Juz'i. So these are risalas on the particular will, and the particular will as the partial power of human volition, which humans have according to Ṣadr al-Shari'a and Māturīdī doctrine, was also strongly built on the thought or on the theory of Ṣadr al-Shari'a. And the second genre, which often intersects with this category, because many of these texts are specifically about the question of human volition is the already mentioned genre earlier, the genre of differences, intermadhab differences in the field of kalām between the Ash'ariyya and the Māturīdiyya. And it is, as this genre is mostly an Ottoman genre, unsurprisingly, usually it is used to champion a distinctively Māturīdī identity. It is also noteworthy that this genre of ikhtilaf al-mazahib and also this attitude of championing a distinctively Māturīdī approach also spreads to India. So in the 17th century, we also find a gloss on the Muqaddimat al-Arba'a by the most eminent moral scholar of the day, Abd al-Hakim al-Siyalkuti. And this luminary also induced his son, Abdallah Labib, to likewise write his own gloss on the four prolegomena. As far as the spread of this distinctively pro-Māturīdī attitude is concerned, I would say the most prominent example is the founder of the Naqshbandiyya Mujadidiyya, Ahmad Sirhindi, who says explicitly in his in one of his work, in Mabdul al-Ma'ab, he says the view of this fakir is in agreement with those of the ulama of the Māturīdiyya in all of the diverging topics of kalām. Now, to give some examples from this ikhtilaf literature, the most elaborate, the most influential of these ikhtilaf texts in kalām was arguably the Isharat al-Maram of al-Bayadi, which is strongly based on at-Tadil and at-Tawdih of Ṣadr al-Shari'a. And in his section on human volition, for example, he quotes the introduction of Ṣadr al-Shari'a to the four prolegomena directly, and then he summarizes each of the each muqaddimah to then reproduce Ṣadr al-Shari'a's or then the accepted Māturīdī view on human volition. Another good example would be from a century later. There would be the major 18th century Anatolian Naqshbandi Sheikh al-Khadimi, and this quote I will give from al-Khadimi shows very much how scholars in the Ottoman Empire were, or many scholars in the Ottoman Empire were of the view that Ṣadr al-Shari'a had definitely settled the discussion on human volition. As al-Khadimi plainly notes after his own expositions, the verification of its status, that is the status of human volition, is to be found in the Muqaddimat al-Arba'a of at-Tawdih. But of course, this dominance of pro-Māturīdī references, this dominance of the thought of Ṣadr al-Shari'a on the crucial issue of human volition did not pass uncontested, of course. So if an important counter opinion, for example, also from the Naqshbandi spectrum from the time of al-Khadimi would be the famous Damascene Naqshbandi Sheikh Abdul Ghani Nabulusi. He also wrote a separate work comparing the Ash'ari and Māturīdī approach to the question of human volition, and he didn't intend to champion a specifically Māturīdī point of view, but rather to harmonize the two tendencies and to argue that actually both schools were of the same opinion. So for Nabulusi, the refutation of the Ash'aris by Ṣadr al-Shari'a naturally doesn't sit well. So what does he say? And I quote here again, he says concerning Ṣadr al-Shari'a al-Thani, he was their imam in diverging in this question. because he was the first one to go astray in it, as has been shown by al-Thānī in al-Talwīḥ. So he takes the position of the counter-refutation of al-Thānī and rejects Ṣadr al-Shari'a's elaborations as a form of going astray. The last thing I want to mention before I will hasten to conclude this presentation is that as this format was so predisposed for intermadhab discussions, so predisposed to show mastery of philosophically laden kalām, that it also turned up in debates between Islamic reformist scholars critical of legal and theological madhabism and overly speculative kalām and their contenders. So, for example, among the Tatars in the Ural-Volga region in the second half of the 19th century, there was a scholarly debate fought out inter alia via glosses to al-Thānī's al-Talwīḥ between the well-known Tatar Islamic reformist Shihab ad-Din al-Marjani and his local contender al-Tuntari, I mean. So to come to a conclusion, the debate of the four prolegomena, as found in al-Tawdīḥ, came, in my opinion, to serve as one of the major hallmarks of all of the formation of distinctively Ottoman Māturīdī identity, which was not something which had been flowing around, if you will, in Ḥanafī circles since the time of al-Maturīdī, but which developed over many centuries. And as by the time or by the 15th century, the influence of the new wave of Ash'ari kalām, al-Ijī, al-Taftazani, al-Jurjani, was arguably dominant in the Ottoman Empire, despite its Ḥanafī, or despite its close association to the Ḥanafī school. This, of course, posed a problem, because the problem was that the dominant new wave of kalām, it came from the wrong side of the spectrum. It came from the Shafi'i Ash'ari spectrum, and in that respect, it conflicted with a number of key Māturīdī doctrines. And on the other hand, classical Māturīdī works were not state of the art, if you will, to respond to this new type of Ash'ari kalām. And this was eventually something which was successfully done only by Ṣadr al-Shari'a and his kalām-related discussions in al-Tawdīḥ. Finally, I have this last picture, which is one of an edition of al-Tawdīḥ and al-Talwīḥ published in Cairo in 1888. And you see it has a whole number of glosses spanning 400 years of time. And even if it is for us often difficult to grasp like this, the century-long structures of discussions around a specific text, I would say that these publishers in 1888, they very much succeeded in compressing hundreds of years of debates on uṣūl al-fiqh and kalām from the author's time to the Tatar reformist al-Marjani within 3 volumes of this work. Thank you.